Now what we need to do is use PHP to actually validate this form. So the first thing we need to do is go above where we created our form and say that we're going to be using PHP code up here now. And the first thing we want to do is turn our error reporting on using error reporting and say e_all, so it will successfully display any errors that we have. And then we want to use any_set to display errors, and we want to turn this one on as well. Now when somebody puts in wrong information or doesn't fill out a field here and click submit, we want to display an error. So to do this, we want to create error value variables. So we're going to need a first name error, and instead of creating these all individually, we'll just create them all in a row. So we'll also need a last name error variable, an email error variable, and a message error variable. And all of these we just want to set to empty strings for now. And inside of our spans is where we want to display these error variables if they don't fill out something correctly. So for now, even though we don't have the functionality of that set up yet, what we want to do is distinguish PHP code with inside of our span elements here, just like I'm doing. And what we want to do is echo the error. And for our first name, we want to echo the first name error variable. And for the rest of these, we can just copy this and paste it in. So for our last name, we want to echo the last name error. For our email, we want to echo the email error variable. And for our message, we want to echo out the message error. Next, we need to create our form variables. And this is where we're going to create variables to grab all of the information that our user inputs here. So this is going to be similar to what we just did, but this time it's just going to be first name followed by last name followed by our email and our message. And again, we're just going to make these equal to empty strings for now. So basically what we're doing here is we're just initializing our variables here as empty strings. And then we want to display something after our user submits the form. So what we're going to do is create a variable called form display, and this is going to be displayed once the user submits the form. We're going to make this equal to an empty string. Next, we need to create a variable to test if our validation passes. So we'll call this our validation pass variable, and we'll make this equal to the Boolean value of true. Next, we're going to create a function using our function keyword, and this is going to be called test_input. And what this function is going to do is it's going to clean up any values that the user inputs. And this function is going to have a parameter of data. And then the first thing we want to do is take our data. We want to trim it to get rid of any extra spaces or anything. So we'll use trim, and then all we need to do is pass in our data, and trim is just a built-in method in PHP. And we're just going to copy and paste this below and change trim to strip slashes. Then we'll paste it one more time. We want to make sure that we get rid of any HTML special characters so nobody can hack us or send in vicious information through our forms. And here we just want to return our data. Now that we have everything set up, is we're going to actually get into our form validation. So to start off, we're going to create an if statement, and inside of this we want to include the following code to see if our server method is post. So here we'll include a $_server followed by brackets, quotation marks, and then we want to see what the request method is, and we want to see if that is equal to post. And in our case, we have our method down here set to post, so this would be true. So if it is post, which it is, what we need to do is create another if statement, and we need to see if this first input value is empty. So what we want to do is use our empty method, and we want to use $_post to get our fname input. So what we're doing here is we're selecting whatever is in this input based on the name attribute. So that's why we're using fname, because we're using this to get whatever the user enters in this input here. So if this is empty, what we need to do is display our fname error. So this will simply say first name is required. And then since this is empty, we want to change our validation pass variable to false because it's not going to pass our form validation. So what I need to do down here now is I need to change the action of this form. And obviously we have all of our PHP form validation on the same page. So we need to run this code up here that we just created. So to do this is we want to include PHP code within our action here, and we want to echo use HTML special characters just to add an extra layer of security, and we want to use our server again, but inside of our square brackets we want to say PHP underscore self. And what this is going to do is our action is going to be tied to the PHP code on this particular page. That's why we're using PHP self here. And then we also want to navigate to our target ID. So we'll say hashtag target here, and keep in mind we haven't created this yet, but we will in a second. So now if I go ahead and refresh my page here and I don't enter anything for the first name, but I go ahead and click submit, you're going to see that first name is required renders onto the page because this input is empty, and that's what we're checking for right here. But if there is something inside of this input, what we need to do is create an else statement, and we need to use our fname variable, and we need to use our test input to further clean up whatever the user entered. So what we can do is we can use this code here again to get that value and just paste it right here. So what will happen is if something is entered here, like let's say I enter my name Tom, it's going to take this value here, test if it's empty or not, but since this is not empty, it's going to run this code. So it's going to run Tom or whatever else the user might enter through our test input function to make sure nothing vicious is coming into our form, and it cleans up any excess like any spaces or anything weird that somebody might enter. So what we can do now is simply copy this, paste it down below, and instead of using fname here is we can just go ahead and change all of these to last name instead. And then here we want this obviously to say last name is required. Now we'll go ahead and paste it again for our email. So once again, we'll go ahead and change all of these out to email. Here we're going to go ahead and say email is required, but for our email we also need to see if this is actually a legitimate email or not. So what we need to do is create an else if here, and inside of our else if, what we want to do is include the not sign, which is going to be an exclamation mark, and we need to use our filter var method, get the value using $_post of our email input, and we need to see if this is a legitimate email or not. So we'll use filter _ validate, and then we want to say email. So this is basically going to check if our inputted value for email here is a legitimate email or not. And what we can do to make this quicker is go ahead and copy this, paste it down below, and instead of email is required, we want to say enter a valid email, and then we can just leave validation pass as false. So now we're going to go back to our contact.php, and I'm going to not enter anything for any of these fields and go ahead and hit submit. You guys are going to say it says first name is required, last name is required, and email is required. But if I enter something invalid here in the email box, because this is obviously not a legitimate email, hit submit, it's going to say enter a valid email. Now what we need to do is copy this code, and paste it down here. And this is all just going to get changed out to message this time. So we'll just say message, and then we want to say message is required. Now what you guys are going to notice over here is, let's say I go ahead and put my first name here and click submit. Even though these three fields down here are incorrect, it should keep the value from the first field that I entered. So to do that, what we're going to do is go back down to our form, and for each input element, what we want to do is create a value attribute like so. And we want to make this equal to PHP code using our PHP declaration here. And we need to echo out our variables. So for this one, we'll go ahead and echo our first name variable, and I need to make sure I put the $sign here. So now if I go over here and refresh, I'll go ahead and hit cancel. Just go back to your home page and then go back to the contact to refresh it. Let's say I enter my first name of Tom and go ahead and click submit. You guys are going to see that even though these last three inputs are incorrect, it keeps the value of this first input. So if I entered this one correctly, let's say, I don't have to go back and re-input it again. So what this does is it just makes the user experience much better. So instead of having to redo everything, you only redo the portions that you messed up or didn't include correctly. So what we're going to go ahead and do is just copy and paste these value attributes for each input and also for our text area down below. And all I need to do is just change these out. So for our last name, we'll change this to last name. For our email, we'll change this to email. And for our message, we'll just go ahead and again change this to message. So now if I go back over here, I need to go ahead and refresh again. And then you might need to navigate to your home and go back to your contact page again. Let's say I enter my first name, I enter a last name, and I also enter an email address here and go ahead and click submit, but don't include anything for the message. You guys will see it keeps these first three input values here and just says message is required. Now that we have everything successfully validated, what we need to do is go down here underneath our last else statement. And what we need to do is set up another if statement, and we want to check if our validation passes. So we're going to use our validation pass variable here, and if everything passes successfully, this will evaluate to true and run the code that we're about to include here. So what we want to do is copy all of these form variables here, and if our validation passes, the first thing we want to do is go ahead and clear out each one of our input fields. So now if we refresh this page again and I enter everything correctly this time, what it will do is it will remove all of these input fields for security purposes once you hit submit. So since I have everything entered correctly, once I click submit, you guys will see it clears out those input fields. Tap here to see what happens next.